The convoy had 500 Marines inside it. She had one rifle, no authorization, and a warning that nobody read. When the first rocket hit, the valley turned into a furnace. Burning steel. Screaming men. Bodies in the dirt. And from a crumbling tower high above the killing zone, a 27-year-old communications sergeant made a choice that would either save hundreds of lives or end her own career in handcuffs. They told her she was wrong. They told her to be quiet. They told her she didn't belong. She proved every single one of them wrong in the most brutal way possible. If you're watching this right now, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Like, subscribe, and stay with me until the very end. You will not regret it. The signal's intelligence bay never really slept. It existed in a permanent state of dim fluorescence and recycled air, a bunker-sized room buried inside the eastern wing of Fort Iron Ridge's command facility. Banks of receivers hummed along the far wall. Headsets dangled from hooks like shed skins. Coffee cups sat in various stages of abandonment across folding tables that had been requisitioned sometime during the previous decade and never replaced. The whole place smelled of machine heat and old paper and the particular staleness of air that had been breathed by too many people for too many consecutive hours. Sergeant Nora Bennett sat in the same chair she'd occupied for the past 11 hours, and she was not sleeping. She had her headset on. She had her notepad open. And she had the cold, specific kind of focus that only comes when someone has been staring at the same problem long enough to start seeing the shape of it, the negative space, the places where things should be and aren't. That was the thing about radio silence. Most people heard nothing. Nora heard a pattern. She pulled off the headset and pressed her fingers against her eyes. 27 years old, 3 years at Fort Iron Ridge, 2 deployments before that, one of which had been in a listening capacity that technically didn't appear in most official records. She had a talent. Her instructors had called it a talent, though the way they said it sometimes felt closer to an accusation, for reading traffic patterns the way other people read body language. Not just what was being said, but the rhythm of it, the gaps, the deliberate silences that were somehow louder than transmission. For the past 4 days, something in the Eastern Corridor frequencies had been wrong. She spread the transcripts across the table, real ones, printed on actual paper, because she'd learned early that physical documentation was harder to lose than digital files. Her handwriting covered the margins in tight, angular notes, timestamps, frequency shifts, call signs that appeared once and then vanished, others that reappeared on unexpected channels, briefly, like a hand testing a door before pulling back. The pattern, if you knew how to read it, said one thing very clearly. Someone is preparing a coordinated attack. They've gone quiet because they're ready. Nora had submitted her first intelligence assessment 3 days ago. A full write-up, 12 pages, supporting evidence attached, submitted through proper channels to Captain Derek Walsh in the Intelligence Coordination Office, who had acknowledged receipt with a 2-word reply, "Noted, Sergeant," and had, as far as she could tell, done absolutely nothing with it. She had submitted a second assessment 24 hours later. Then a third, 2 hours ago, this one stripped down to a single page because she'd read somewhere that senior officers responded better to brevity. She had written in plain language that required no interpretation. The Carvan Pass route presents a high-probability ambush scenario. I recommend delaying the 0530 convoy pending threat reassessment. She had hand-delivered that one to Walsh's office. Walsh had told her, not unkindly, that Colonel Hale had reviewed the corridor intelligence and found no actionable concern. He reviewed it? Nora had asked. The summary was included in his daily brief. She'd stared at Walsh long enough that he'd started to look uncomfortable. The summary, she said, not the full assessment. Sergeant, the supporting traffic analysis was in the full assessment. The frequency correlation data, the call sign reappearance on the secondary channel. Sergeant Bennett, Walsh had lowered his voice in the particular way that signaled a conversation was being ended rather than concluded. Colonel Hale has 31 years of combat experience. He's assessed this route before. The convoy departs at 0530. She'd left Walsh's office with 12 pages of intelligence that felt suddenly, terrifyingly useless. Now it was 0347, and Nora was looking at a map. The Carvan Pass was a 23-kilometer stretch of mountain road that wound through terrain so narrow in places that 2 vehicles could barely pass each other. On either side Ridgelines rose steeply, studded with outcropping rock formations and deep vegetation shadows. Natural cover that an infantry unit with patience and discipline could exploit almost indefinitely. The eastern approach was particularly bad. A dogleg turn at kilometer 7 that forced vehicles to slow almost to a stop, then a long straightaway that offered exposure from 3 separate elevated positions simultaneously. She'd flagged all of this. It was in the assessment. Nora traced the route with her finger and felt something cold settle in her stomach. 500 Marines, 42 vehicles. A supply convoy, technically, but with personnel mixed in because the logistics had gotten complicated, as logistics always did, and someone had decided to consolidate the transport run. Normal. Efficient. Catastrophic, if she was right. She thought about the radio silence on the eastern frequencies. She thought about the call sign that had appeared 3 days ago on a channel that should have been clean, a channel previously associated with a small cell that had gone completely dark 6 weeks ago, dark in the way that usually meant they'd either been eliminated or had gone deeper underground. And the way that same call sign had reappeared for exactly 40 seconds yesterday afternoon on a completely different frequency before vanishing again. Testing. They were testing their network. Final confirmation before execution. She'd written that in the assessment too. Someone reviewed the summary. Nora stood up, walked to the small reinforced window that looked out onto the interior courtyard of the base, and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. A corporal was crossing the courtyard below with his collar turned up against the pre-dawn cold. She watched him disappear around a corner. She thought about this other possibility, the one she kept pushing aside because it was uncomfortable, that she was wrong. She'd been wrong before. Not often, but once. 18 months ago, a threat assessment she'd filed had turned out to be based on misidentified call signs, a frequency coincidence that had looked meaningful and wasn't. She'd been embarrassed. Colonel Hale, who hadn't been her direct CO at the time, but had been present at the debrief, had made a remark about the dangers of pattern matching without sufficient evidence base. The remark had been measured, professional, and precisely targeted. She still heard it sometimes. Pattern matching without sufficient evidence base. She went back to her transcripts, looked at them again with fresh eyes, trying to find the place where she could be wrong. She couldn't find it. She tried one more time. Colonel Richard Hale's office was on the 2nd floor of the command building. He arrived early, that was well known, and he was there when Nora knocked at 0412, a single sharp knock she'd rehearsed to be confident without being aggressive. Enter. He was behind his desk, reading something. He was a large man, not running to fat large, but structurally large, the kind of frame built for the weight of rank. Gray at his temples, a jaw that had probably never been described as soft. His uniform was already pressed at 0412 in the morning, which told her something about the kind of man he was. She stepped inside and came to attention. He glanced up. A slight pause. A recalibration behind his eyes. Bennett. Sir, I apologize for the early hour. I wanted to speak with you directly about the Carvon Pass convoy. I'm aware of your assessments. Then you're aware of the frequency correlation data in the full report, sir. The call sign reappearance on the... I'm aware of your assessments, he said again, and this time the emphasis was placement, not information. Nora absorbed that. He hasn't read it. She kept her voice level. Sir, the traffic patterns over the past 72 hours are consistent with pre-attack network testing by a coordinated cell. The eastern ridge line at kilometer 7 of the Carvon Pass provides... Sergeant? He set down whatever he'd been reading, looked at her fully. Not unkindly, not cruelly, just with the particular flatness of someone who has already decided something. How long have you been in signals intelligence? 3 years, sir. Have you ever been in a firefight? The question sat between them like a stone. No, sir. Have you ever called in a fire mission, directed infantry movement, made a tactical decision under contact? No, sir. I have. He said it without inflection, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with pride. 31 years of it. I've seen threat assessments like yours before, Sergeant. Analysts see patterns because the brain is built to find them. Sometimes where they exist, sometimes where they don't. What I can tell you is that the Carvon corridor has been used 4 times in the past 3 months without incident. With respect, sir, that may be why they chose it. Predictability is, the convoy departs at 0530. We're done here. She didn't move immediately. For one fractional second, she stood there looking at a man with 31 years of experience and 12 pages of evidence that he hadn't read. And she felt the weight of both, and she understood with sudden, nauseating clarity that the weight of his experience was going to win. "Yes, sir," she said. She turned and walked out of his office. The bay was quiet when she returned. Most of the night shift analysts had drifted off. A corporal named Jimenez was sleeping in his chair with a headset around his neck, which wasn't technically permitted, but which Nora had always permitted in practice because he was 20 years old and had only been at Fort Iron Ridge for 6 weeks, and she remembered what 6 weeks felt like. She sat down and put her headset on. At 05:03, she heard it, a single transmission. 11 seconds. Encoded. They were always encoded now, never clear voice. But the frequency, the timing, the specific rhythmic quality of the burst pattern sent something cold through her chest. She wrote it down immediately, hands moving fast. 0503:12. Eastern Corridor, same cell, confirmation burst. She knew what that was. She'd studied enough of their traffic to know what a confirmation burst looked like. It was the kind of transmission that happened when a unit was in position and checking in, not planning anymore, not testing anymore. Ready. Her hand was shaking slightly when she put the pen down. She sat for a moment with that knowledge, with the weight of what it meant. Outside, she could hear the distant rumble of diesel engines warming up. The convoy staging area was on the north side of the base, about 400 meters away, and at this hour the sound carried clean through the dark. 42 vehicles. 500 people. She picked up her handset and tried Walsh's office. No answer. She tried the duty officer. The duty officer told her that Colonel Hale had personally authorized the departure and that she needed to submit any new intelligence through the appropriate channel for review. She asked what the turnaround time was. The duty officer said 48 to 72 hours for non-emergency classification. She put the handset down. The convoy was leaving in 22 minutes. She sat in the signals bay for 8 of those minutes. She thought about court-martials. She thought about the corporal sleeping in his chair, how he'd wake up in a few hours and find her gone, and what he'd think. She thought about her mother, who had a photograph of Nora in dress uniform on the mantelpiece, and called once a week to ask how things were going. And Nora always said, "Fine, Mom. Things are fine." She thought about the dogleg turn at kilometer 7. She thought about 42 vehicles and what an RPG does to the second one in a column when the first one is already stopped and burning. She stood up. She went to her equipment locker. They called it the widow's post, and nobody used it anymore. It was a concrete structure built on a ridgeline about 2 kilometers northeast of the base perimeter, part of an old defensive network that had been decommissioned when the base expanded and the threat axis shifted. Getting there required crossing open ground, then climbing a drainage ravine, then navigating a section of loose shale that wanted to send you down the hill in pieces. Nora made it in 18 minutes. The tower itself was 4 floors of poured concrete, cracked and weather-stained, with iron stairs that flexed underfoot in a way she tried not to think about too carefully. At the top, through a gap where a wall section had deteriorated, she had a view that opened south and east across the mountain corridor. The long valley, the ridgelines on both sides, the twisting gray ribbon of the Carvon Road, visible in sections through the early morning haze. She unpacked the rifle. It was her issued weapon. She hadn't stolen it, technically. A Mark 11 Mod 0 semi-automatic chambered in 7.62 by 51 NATO. Sniper designation, though Nora was not a sniper. She was a signals intelligence specialist who had, on her own time, spent enough hours on the base's long-range range to be competent at distances that made the duty range officers mildly uncomfortable. She'd grown up hunting with her father in Montana. He'd been particular about it in the way that particular fathers are. Patient, demanding, unwilling to let sloppy become habit. Competent was not the same as trained. She knew that. She was here anyway. She set up on the broken wall remnant, using her pack as a rest, and raised her binoculars. The convoy was already in the valley below, 42 vehicles, winding into the mountain road, dust rising behind them in pale morning light. She could see the dogleg turn ahead, kilometer 7, coming up fast, and on either side of it, the ridgeline sat quiet and dark and full of shadows that could be nothing or could be everything. She looked at those shadows for a long time. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. She'd expected fear to make them shake, but what she felt instead wasn't exactly fear. It was something quieter and colder, a kind of absolute conviction that had no room left in it for trembling. She settled into her position and put her eye to the scope. The valley waited. The convoy turned the dogleg, and then the mountains caught fire. The first rocket hit the third vehicle from the front, not the lead vehicle, which was standard insurgent doctrine, designed to stop the column without destroying the point element outright, forcing everything behind it to accordion into a kill zone. A fireball bloomed orange and black, a percussion she felt in her sternum from 2 kilometers away, a deep concussive thump that arrived a half-second after the light. Then the second rocket, 4 seconds later, hitting the rear of the column at the same moment the ridgelines erupted with machine gun fire from at least 3 separate positions. Tracer lines cut through the morning haze like red stitching. The convoy stopped moving. It had no choice. The road was blocked at both ends, vehicles jackknifed, and she could see small figures scrambling off the road, finding whatever cover existed, which wasn't much on the straightaway section. The sound was overwhelming even at distance. Not just the weapons, but the burning, the secondary explosions as fuel cooked off, the chaos of 500 people trying to understand all at once what was happening to them. Nora had about 3 seconds of paralysis. Not fear exactly, just the brain catching up to what the eyes were already processing. Then she was working. She found the first machine gun nest by the tracer lines. Western ridgeline, elevated position, behind a rock formation at roughly 900 meters. She adjusted for elevation, for the crosswind she'd been reading since she arrived, for the angle of the slope. She fired. The gun kept firing for another 4 seconds, then stopped. Maybe I got lucky. Maybe they moved. She didn't have time to analyze it. She moved the scope east, second position. Easier. They were backlit slightly by the burning vehicles below, silhouetted against the smoke in a way they probably didn't realize. She could see the gun team clearly through the scope. 2 figures, one feeding the belt, one behind the receiver. She fired twice. The gun went silent. She worked. She did not think of it as killing. She thought of it as signal suppression. Find a position, evaluate, engage, move to the next one. It was the same cognitive architecture she applied to frequency traffic, and she leaned on that framing deliberately because the alternative, thinking about what she was actually doing, about what each shot meant, would have made her hands shake, and shaking hands were something she could not afford right now. She did not know how long it lasted. Later, she would be told it was 41 minutes from first contact to when the enemy fire stopped being organized. She remembered maybe 15 of those minutes with any real clarity. The rest existed as a series of impressions: the smell of her own weapon, the growing ache in her shoulder, a moment when something hit the tower structure below her and the whole building swayed in a way that felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. She remembered a point, she wasn't sure when she'd realized that the firing from the valley had changed character, that the Marines were no longer just defending, they were moving. Someone down there had gotten organized, had found the angles, was using the suppression she was providing without knowing what it was or where it was coming from. Good, she'd thought. Work with it. Go. When it ended, the valley was full of smoke and the specific terrible quiet that follows sustained combat. The quiet that isn't peaceful, just the absence of something that had been too loud. Nora sat back from the wall remnant and put the rifle down and looked at her hands. They were shaking, badly. She hadn't let herself feel it while she was working. Now there was nothing left to do, and the feeling arrived all at once, and she sat in the ruins of the widow's post with the rising sun cutting through the smoke below, and waited for her hands to stop. They didn't stop for a long time. She walked back through the base perimeter and was arrested 15 minutes later. It wasn't dramatic. 2 military police approached her in the equipment bay while she was field stripping her rifle. She finished the field strip first because it needed to be cleaned and she wasn't going to leave it dirty. And Sergeant Villanueva told her she was being detained and asked her to come with them. Okay, she said. The interrogation room was the kind of room that communicated its function entirely through the absence of anything comfortable. Metal table. 4 chairs. A camera in the corner. A water bottle that had been opened and was 3/4 empty, which told her someone had sat here recently but had left before finishing it. She sat down and waited. She waited for an hour and 40 minutes. Colonel Richard Hale entered the room alone. He closed the door and stood across the table from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She looked at his face and saw something she hadn't expected. He wasn't angry. He looked like a man who was working very hard to be angry and finding that some other emotion kept getting in the way. He sat down. "You're going to be charged," he said. "Absent without leave, theft of government property, dereliction of duty, conduct unbecoming, unauthorized use of a weapon." A pause. "There may be additional charges pending a full incident review." "Yes, sir," Nora said. "Is there anything you want to say for yourself?" She thought about 12 pages nobody had read, about 0503 hours and a confirmation burst on the Eastern frequency, about the third vehicle in the convoy and the way the fireball had looked from 2 kilometers away. "I submitted 3 intelligence assessments, sir," she said. Each one identified the Carvon Pass as a high-probability ambush site. Each one was either not reviewed or dismissed without a full analysis of the supporting data. Hale's jaw tightened. "I attempted to contact the duty officer at 0508 hours with new information," she continued. "The call was received, but no action was taken. I made the determination that the most effective means of addressing the threat was direct." "You made the determination," he said very quietly. "Yes, sir." "You'd Shinta." A signals intelligence sergeant with no tactical training, no sniper qualification, no authority to engage, and no authorization of any kind, made the determination to take a government weapon, leave your post, and engage enemy forces from a decommissioned position without so much as a radio call to let anyone know what you were doing. "Yes, sir, that's accurate." He stared at her. "And you don't apologize for it." She thought about the dogleg at kilometer 7, about 42 vehicles stopped on a road with no cover. "I can apologize for the procedural violations, sir," she said. "I cannot apologize for the outcome." The silence that followed was the longest of her life up to that point. Outside, somewhere in the base, a door opened. Voices. Bootsteps in the corridor, moving fast, getting louder. Hale's head turned slightly toward the sound. The interrogation room door opened without a knock. The man who walked in was still wearing his kit, body armor with a strap that had been cut rather than unbuckled. Someone had kneaded it off quickly, which meant at some point the situation had required that. His face was dust pale with 2 streaks of something darker across his left cheekbone, and his eyes had the specific flatness of a man who had come from somewhere very bad, very recently, and had not yet fully arrived anywhere else. He looked at Colonel Hale. Then he looked at Nora. "Is this her?" he said. Hale said, "Captain Brooks?" "Is this her?" he said again, not loud, just certain. "Yes," Hale said. Captain Ethan Brooks, commander of the convoy that had gone into the Carvon Pass at 0530 that morning, looked at Sergeant Nora Bennett for a long moment without speaking. She looked back at him. There was dust in his eyebrows. There was a tremor in his left hand that she suspected he didn't know about. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily, like the structure of his body had been waiting for permission to do that. "They're going to charge her," Hale said. "I know." Brooks hadn't stopped looking at Nora. "I heard." A pause, the weight of something being organized behind his eyes. "I need to say something, sir, and I need you to hear it before this goes any further." Hale said nothing. Brooks reached into a cargo pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, a printout, edges worn from handling in the past few hours. He set it on the table. "I had 23 KIA today, Colonel," he said. 23. In an ambush that hit us in exactly the position, from exactly the elevations, that this intelligence report predicted. He pushed the paper slightly toward Hale, "which I received 40 minutes ago from Captain Walsh's files, where it had been sitting for 3 days. The room was very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. "I had 23 killed," Brooks said again. "My best estimate, given the firepower those positions were putting down before they went quiet, one by one, from a direction I still can't fully account for, is that without whatever happened on that western ridgeline, I was looking at north of 100 dead, maybe significantly more." Hale looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up. "Sir," Brooks said, "I'm not here to make your decisions for you. I'm here because 23 of my Marines are dead and 412 are alive, and I think you should know which half of that number this sergeant is responsible for." The silence stretched. Nora looked at the water bottle. 3/4 empty. She wondered who had sat here before her, what they'd been waiting to find out. She didn't feel like the hero. She felt like someone who had been awake for 29 hours and whose hands were still not entirely steady. Hale picked up the paper. He read it. He read the whole thing, and it took him a while, and nobody spoke while he did. When he set it down, his face had changed in a way she couldn't entirely name. Something had gone out of it, not the authority. That was structural, built over 31 years, not the kind of thing that leaves in a single morning. Something else. Something that had been there at 04:12 when he'd told her the convoy was departing at 05:30 and they were done. He looked at her. She looked back. "Get her some water," he said quietly, to no one in particular. Then he stood up and walked out of the room, taking her 12-page assessment with him. And for a very long time after the door closed, the only sound in the room was the distant noise of the bass going about its afternoon, indifferent and ongoing, while inside that small metal-tabled room, everything had already changed. The water arrived 20 minutes later, brought by a specialist who set it on the table without making eye contact and left faster than he'd come in. Nora drank half of it in one go. Her throat had been raw since the tower, dust, cordite, the dry mountain air. And she hadn't let herself think about it until now. Captain Brooks hadn't moved from his chair. He was still in his kit, forearms on the table, looking at a fixed point somewhere between himself and the wall. The tremor in his left hand had gotten worse. Or maybe she was just paying more attention to it now. She didn't say anything about it. "How many of them got out?" she said finally. He looked up. "Of the ambush force?" "Yeah. We're still doing an assessment, maybe 40%. He paused. "Some of them pulled back clean before we could get air on the ridgelines. It wasn't—" He stopped, restarted. It wasn't a clean outcome. It was just a less bad one. She nodded. "The positions on the western ridge," he said. "The ones that went quiet. That was you." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment in a way that made her want to say something to fill the space, which was probably why he did it, to see what she'd put there. She kept her mouth shut. "I was a sniper," he said, "scout sniper, 1st Battalion, before I got a company. So when I'm in contact and suddenly the position that's been chewing through my vehicles just stops. Not suppressed, not shifted, stops. I know what that means." He rubbed the back of his neck. "What I couldn't figure out is the angle. The geometry was wrong for the position I'd have chosen, too exposed to the north." "The widow's post," Nora said. Something moved across his face. "That building's condemned. The staircase is bad. The top floor is fine." "How far was your longest shot?" She thought about it. She'd stopped counting somewhere in the middle and had only recalculated afterward, going over her firing positions mentally during the walk back. 1,100 meters on the last one, maybe 11.2. The wind had shifted by then, and I was working with a rough reed. Brooks was quiet for a moment. "You're not a sniper," he said. "No, sir." "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" "Ranges. My own time." She hesitated. "And I hunted with my father when I was young. He was very particular about it." Brooks made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Where are you from?" "Montana." "Of course you are," he said, and this time it was close enough to a laugh that she let herself almost smile. Then the door opened and the almost smile went away, because the man who walked in was not Hale, and was not Villanueva, and was not anyone Nora recognized. He was a lieutenant colonel with a JAG branch insignia and the specific type of calm that comes from professional practice rather than temperament. "Sergeant Bennett," he said, "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Marsh. I'll be managing your case." Brooks stood up, looked at Marsh, looked at the insignia. "She needs a defense counsel," Brooks said. "She'll be assigned one," Marsh said pleasantly. "Today." "That process?" "Today," Brooks said again, in the same tone. And it was the first time Nora had heard what a company commander sounded like when the politeness was just a surface. "Are we going to have a problem, Colonel?" Marsh looked at him with the measured patience of a man who dealt with combat officers regularly and had long since stopped being impressed by the voice. "Captain, I understand you've had a difficult morning. I'd encourage you to let the process work." "The process," Brooks said, "almost got 400 of my people killed this morning. You'll forgive me if I'm not moved by that argument right now." He looked at Nora once more. and the look said something she filed away carefully. Then he walked out. The room felt different without him in it. Smaller, somehow. Marsh sat down across from her and opened a folder that he'd been carrying and set it between them. Inside was a charge sheet. She could read it upside down well enough to confirm what Hale had already told her. AWOL, theft, dereliction, conduct unbecoming, unauthorized engagement. Do you understand these charges? Marsh said. Yes. You're entitled to remain silent until counsel is present. I know. I'd advise using that right. She looked at the charge sheet, at her name printed at the top in the flat, administrative font that the military used for everything from commendations to courts-martial. Bennett, Nora a basi seshaktachind. I'm not going to deny any of it, she said. Marsh studied her. That is your right. It's also potentially inadvisable. I know what I did. I know why I did it. I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. He closed the folder slightly, not all the way, just enough to signal he was shifting modes. Sergeant, I want to be direct with you. The investigation into this morning's incident is going to be broad. It's going to examine not just your actions, but the intelligence process leading up to the convoy departure. Your assessments, the handling of those assessments, the command decisions made on the basis of them. He paused. That context matters. Does it matter enough to change the charges? I don't know yet. He met her eyes. What I can tell you is that there are people in this building right now having conversations about this incident that will determine how much that context matters. Some of those people are on your side, some are not. She thought about Hale walking out with her 12-page assessment, the way his face had changed. Who's not on my side, she said. Marsh's expression didn't shift. The institutional interest of any command is to demonstrate that its processes work. When something goes wrong, the question becomes how to frame the failure. If the frame becomes our intelligence was wrong, that's one story. If it becomes a junior NCO went rogue, that's a different story. A pause. Both stories have someone to blame. Only one of them involves you going to prison. Nora looked at the water bottle. I submitted 3 assessments, she said. I know. The timestamps are in the system. The delivery records are in the system. Walsh acknowledged receipt in writing. I know, Marsh said again. So they can't say the intelligence was wrong. They can say it was ignored, but they can't say... She stopped, thought about it more carefully. They can say I didn't follow up aggressively enough. They can say the assessments were ambiguous or incomplete. They can say a lot of things about the quality of the analysis. Yes, Marsh said, and the word was quiet and precise. She understood then. Not just the charges, not just the process, but the shape of what she was actually facing. The charges were almost secondary. The real fight was about which story survived. She picked up the water bottle and finished it. They put her in a room that wasn't quite a cell, administrative hold, technically, while the process moved. It had a cot and a small window that looked out at a concrete wall, and it was, in its own way, not so different from the signals bay. A small space, artificial light. The sense of the outside world happening without her. She slept for 4 hours. Real sleep, not the half-conscious vigilance of the tower. She didn't dream. When she woke up, it was afternoon and the base had a different sound to it. Not louder, but denser, more traffic in the corridors, more vehicle movement outside. She'd been around enough incidents to know what investigative momentum sounded like, the particular activity level of a place that was trying to understand what had happened to it. She used the small bathroom, looked at herself in the mirror, and didn't particularly recognize the face she found there. Not in a dramatic way. Just the flatness that comes from exhaustion of a specific kind. Not physical, not emotional exactly, but something in between. The flatness of having done something that cannot be undone and not yet knowing what comes next. Her defense counsel arrived at 1400. His name was Captain Yusuf Amir, a compact man with careful eyes and a habit of tapping his pen against his notepad twice before he started speaking, which she noticed on his first question and every question after that. Tap, tap. Walk me through the morning, he said. Everything from your first contact with the frequency anomaly. She walked him through it, all of it. He listened without interrupting, which was either a good sign or the sign of a man waiting to hear something specific. She couldn't tell which. When she finished, he tapped his pen twice and asked 3 questions, all of them technical, all of them about the radio traffic analysis rather than her actions at the tower. The call sign reappearance, he said. You flagged that in the 3rd assessment. 2nd and 3rd. The 2nd was the 12-pager, yes, which Walsh received and acknowledged. At 15:47 hours, 2 days before the convoy. Tap, tap. Walsh says he forwarded a summary to Colonel Hale's daily intelligence brief. A summary. She kept her voice neutral. Not the full assessment. Correct. He made a note. Sergeant, did you at any point receive explicit written instruction to cease your analysis or refrain from further reporting? She thought about it. Really thought about it. No. Walsh told me verbally that Hale had reviewed the corridor intelligence and found no actionable concern. I was told the convoy was departing. I was not given a written order to stop. Tap, tap. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not much, just a fraction, but she'd been reading people's frequency patterns long enough to catch it. That matters, he said. I know. It doesn't make the tower go away. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me because if you're not, I can't help you. Okay? When you left the base and went to that tower, son, were you thinking about the intelligence process? The fact that your reports had been ignored? Were you angry? She understood the question. It wasn't about her guilt. It was about narrative, about which Nora Bennett was easier to defend. The one who acted from cold, analytical certainty, or the one who was pissed off and went rogue. I was thinking about the dogleg turn at kilometer 7, she said. And what happens to the second vehicle in a column when the first one stops? He held her gaze for a moment. All right, he said. He believed her. Or he'd decided to act as if he did, which, for the purposes of what came next, amounted to the same thing. The formal hearing began on the 4th day. Not a court-martial yet, that was still being debated, but a formal Article 32 investigation, the military equivalent of a preliminary hearing to determine whether the charges had sufficient basis to proceed. They convened in a room large enough for a long table with 6 officers on one side and Nora and Amir on the other, and a hearing officer named Major Felicia Dorn, who had the look of someone who had done this many times and found it neither pleasant nor unpleasant, simply necessary. Walsh was called first. He was a lean man with a tendency to look at the table when he answered questions, which Nora noted without satisfaction. Major Dorn asked him about the assessments, the timestamps, the acknowledgement. Walsh said the summary provided to Colonel Hale's brief had captured the key analytical findings. Dorn asked him to define key analytical findings. Walsh's answer took 2 minutes and said almost nothing. Dorn asked him specifically whether the frequency correlation data identifying the eastern cell's transmission pattern had been included in the summary provided to the brief. A pause. The summary focused on threat probability and route assessment, Walsh said. That's not what I asked. Another pause. No, ma'am. The full technical data was not included in the summary. Dorn made a note. Nora watched Walsh not look at her, and she felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite sympathy. Just the recognition of a man who had made a small procedural decision. I'll send a summary, that's enough. Without understanding the weight of it, and who was now sitting inside the consequence of that decision and finding it much heavier than expected. She didn't hate him for it. She wasn't sure what she felt. She filed it away. Then they called the surveillance technician who had been monitoring the eastern frequencies during the relevant window. Corporal Dean Pratt, 23 years old, who confirmed under direct questioning that the 0503 transmission, the one Nora had logged as a confirmation burst, was consistent with pre-attack network synchronization based on SIGINT analysis protocols. He was the first technical voice to say it out loud in that room. She watched the officers on the other side of the table absorb it. Then Captain Brooks was called. He came in still looking like a man who hadn't fully slept. The tremor in his left hand was gone, or he'd learned to hide it better, one or the other. He sat down, was sworn in, and answered the preliminary questions about his role and his experience in the kind of clipped, direct sentences that combat officers use when they want to get to the point. Dorn asked him to describe the ambush. He described it, clinically. Times, positions, fire volumes, vehicle status, casualty count. He didn't embellish, and he didn't understate. 23 killed. 17 vehicles damaged or destroyed. Initial fire from 3 elevated positions, with a 4th position identified but not engaged before it was neutralized. Neutralized how? Dorn asked. Single-shot engagement from a long-distance position to our north-northeast, Brooks said. The Widow's Post observation tower, as we subsequently determined. You determined that subsequent to the engagement? During the engagement, we knew we had support from somewhere. We did not know the source. I made a decision to use the suppression window to push my people off the road and into covered positions, which we were able to do because the Western gun had gone quiet. He paused. In my assessment, that suppression was the primary reason my casualty count is 23 rather than significantly higher. Significantly higher, Dorn said. Can you quantify that? The Western gun position was an M240 equivalent, heavy caliber, belt-fed, established behind cover with clear fields of fire down the straightaway section of the route. Brooks' voice was even, unhurried. In my professional judgment, if that position had remained active during the period my vehicles were stopped and my personnel were dismounting, the lethality would have been severe. I'd estimate an additional 60 to 100 casualties in the first 15 minutes. The room was quiet. Nora kept her hands flat on the table. Based on your experience, Dorn said, what level of marksmanship would be required to engage and neutralize that position from the Widow's Post? Brooks considered. 1,100 meters, cross slope, moving target through partial smoke obscuration, trained sniper-level proficiency at minimum. Sergeant Bennett does not hold a sniper qualification. No, ma'am. How do you account for that? Brooks looked across the table at Nora for just a moment before answering. Some people have capacity before they have credentials, he said. In my experience, the field has a way of making that very clear, very fast. Dorn wrote something down. After Brooks was excused, the hearing officer called a 20-minute recess. The officers on the other side of the table filed out in a cluster, speaking quietly among themselves, and Amir leaned close to Nora and said very quietly, "That helped." "Does it help enough?" she said. He tapped his pen twice. "Ask me in 48 hours. She looked at the empty chairs across the table, at the chair where Walsh had sat not looking at her, and the chair where Brooks had sat looking at her steadily, and the chair where Dorn had written things down in a notepad that Nora couldn't read. "Amir," she said. "Yeah. What's the actual best-case outcome here?" He was quiet for a moment, honest about the pause. "Best case? Charges reduced to administrative violations. Letter of reprimand. No prison, no discharge." He tapped the pen. "And then the question becomes what comes after that. What does that mean?" "It means there are people in this building having conversations about what to do with someone who did what you did." He glanced at her. "Not just how to punish you, what to do with you." She didn't know what that meant. She didn't ask, because she didn't think he knew exactly either, and she was tired enough that the future felt very far away. The recess ended. The officers filed back in. Major Dorn sat down and opened her notepad to a fresh page, and the afternoon ground forward, and Nora sat in her chair and waited to find out which story would survive. On the 6th day, they brought Colonel Hale back in. She hadn't seen him since he'd walked out of the interrogation room with her 12-page assessment in his hands. She'd thought about that moment often in the days since. The change in his face, the thing that had gone out of it. She'd spent time trying to name it and had eventually settled on the closest word she had. Certainty. The thing that had gone out of his face was certainty. He sat down across from Dorn and answered the preliminary questions in the same even, authoritative voice he'd used in his office at 0412. But something had shifted in the architecture of the man. It was subtle. She wouldn't have caught it if she hadn't been watching closely, but it was there, in the way he paused slightly longer before answering than he had when she'd stood across from him, and he'd told her the convoy was departing at 0530. Dorn asked him about the intelligence assessments. He confirmed receiving the summary in his brief. Dorn asked if he'd reviewed the full assessment. A pause. Longer than any of his other pauses. "No," he said. "I did not." The room held that. "Why not?" Dorn said. He considered the question carefully, and she knew he was a man who prided himself on precision, on never saying things loosely, and she watched him look for the precise language that would carry the truth without the weight of it crushing something he'd built over 31 years. "I assessed the corridor based on recent operational history," he said. 4 successful transits in 3 months. Combined with the summary assessment, I determined additional review was not warranted. The summary assessment authored by Captain Walsh. Yes. Which, as we've established, did not include the full technical data that Sergeant Bennett's analysis was based upon. Another pause. That is correct, Hale said. The certainty that had been missing from his face in the interrogation room was still missing. He looked like what he was, a very experienced officer sitting inside a decision he'd made quickly and would spend a long time thinking about slowly. Nora looked at her hands on the table. She felt nothing in particular, which surprised her. She thought she might feel something like vindication, something like anger finally finding its target. Instead, she felt the same flatness as the morning after the tower, the sense of consequence without resolution. He had 31 years. He had medals she didn't know the names of. He had a reputation that had preceded him into every room she'd ever heard about him in. And he'd dismissed her in 45 seconds at 04:12 in the morning because she was 27 and she worked in signals intelligence and she'd never been in a firefight. She didn't hate him for it either. She didn't have the energy. What she had was 12 pages and a timestamp and 412 names that weren't on a casualty list, and she held on to those things in the place where anger might have lived and found they were heavier and more useful. Dorn asked Hale one more question. Colonel, in retrospect, if you had reviewed the full intelligence assessment submitted by Sergeant Bennett, would you have proceeded with the convoy departure as scheduled? He sat with that for a long moment. I don't know, he said. It was, she realized, probably the most honest thing anyone had said in that room. Dorn wrote it down. The hearing continued for 2 more hours, moving through procedural ground that Amir navigated with quiet competence. Nora answered questions when asked and didn't speak when she wasn't, and somewhere around the 3rd hour she noticed that the officers on the other side of the table were looking at her differently than they had on the first day. Not with warmth, not with anything so simple as that. Just with the recalibrated attention of people who had walked into a room with one picture of someone and had slowly acquired enough data to complicate it. She didn't know what that meant for the charges. She didn't know what it meant for anything. What she knew was that the hearing would end, and something would be decided, and then something after that, and she was too tired to chase any of it into the future. She drank her water. She sat up straight. She waited. The Article 32 hearing concluded on a Thursday afternoon with Major Dorn collecting her notepad and her pen and her carefully neutral expression and telling them she would deliver her findings to the convening authority within 72 hours. 72 hours. Nora had done the math already. That was the weekend, which meant Monday at the earliest, and probably not Monday, and the military's relationship with time was such that 72 hours could become a week without anyone technically lying about it. Amir walked her back to the administrative hold room, and at the door he said, "You did well." And she said, "Did I?" And he said, "You told the truth consistently, and you didn't perform. That's about as well as you can do." Then he left, and she sat on the cot, and the bass made its afternoon sounds around her, and she thought about nothing in particular for a while, which was the closest she'd come to rest in a week. The findings came back in 51 hours. Amir brought them himself, which told her something before he said a word. He sat down across from her in the small room and opened his folder and tapped his pen twice and said, "The recommendation is reduced charges, 2 counts. Dereliction of duty and unauthorized use of government property. Administrative action, not criminal. No court-martial." She let that settle. "The other charges," she said, "dropped. The investigation found sufficient cause to conclude that the absence from post was motivated by legitimate tactical concern in the absence of responsive command action." He read that last part carefully, like he was reading it from the document, which he probably was. That's bureaucratic language for, your intelligence was right, your chain of command didn't act on it, and the prosecution couldn't make Rogue look clean when the math on casualties was sitting right there. What does administrative action mean? Letter of reprimand, formal notation in your record. No imprisonment, no discharge. Tap, tap. Your career takes damage. How much depends on factors that aren't determined yet? She looked at the wall. Hale? His command decisions are under separate review. That process is above my visibility. Amir paused. I've heard things. Nothing I can confirm. What kind of things? The kind that suggests the letter of reprimand in your file might not be the most consequential document generated by this incident. She understood what he was saying without him saying it. The institution had to assign weight somewhere. It was trying to figure out how much of that weight landed on a 27-year-old signals sergeant and how much landed on the colonel who'd held 12 pages in his hands at 04:12 in the morning and set them down unread. She didn't feel satisfied by that. She wasn't sure what she felt. "What happens now?" she said. "You accept the administrative action or you contest it. Contesting it means a formal board, which means more process, more time, more exposure." He met her eyes. "My recommendation is acceptance. The outcome is survivable and contesting it reopens everything." She thought about it for a moment. "Okay," she said. He nodded, made a note, started to close the folder. "Amir," she said. He looked up. "You said my career takes damage. How much is survivable?" He was quiet for a beat longer than comfort required. "That depends on what you do next," he said. "Letters of reprimand aren't career-ending by themselves. What they do is close certain doors. How many depends on who's holding them." She thought about that for a long time after he left. They released her from administrative hold the following morning. She collected her equipment, signed the paperwork, and walked back to the signals bay, feeling like a person returning from a place they'd been away from long enough that it had stopped being familiar. Jimenez was at his station. He looked up when she walked in, started to say something, then clearly couldn't find whatever he'd been looking for and settled for, "Hey, Sergeant." "Hey," she said. She sat at her workstation and put her headset on and listened to the Eastern frequencies for a while. Not because she expected to hear anything, but because it was the most normal thing she could do, and she needed something normal. The other analysts in the bay gave her varying amounts of space. Some of them found reasons to be elsewhere. Two of them, Pratt, who had testified, and a staff sergeant named Ochoa, who Nora had always found difficult to read, made a point of being in her peripheral vision in a way that felt deliberate. Not making contact, just present. She filed that away as something she didn't have the bandwidth to process right now. At 1100, she was called to Colonel Hale's office. She hadn't seen him since the hearing. She hadn't expected to see him this soon, and the summons gave her the specific discomfort of an unresolved equation. She didn't know what he wanted from this meeting, which meant she didn't know who she was supposed to be in it. She knocked once. Enter. He was standing, not sitting, which was different from last time. Standing at the window, a real window in his office, one that looked out at the motor pool, with his hands clasped behind his back. He turned when she came in, and she came to attention, and he said, "At ease, Sergeant," in a voice that sounded like a man who had rewritten something several times. She stood at ease. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. She'd learned to wait. "I owe you something," he said finally. "I've been working out exactly what it is for the past 10 days, and I'm going to tell you that I haven't entirely succeeded." He moved away from the window, not toward her, just into the room. "What I can tell you is that I was wrong to dismiss your assessment without reading it. That was a failure of my process, and it had consequences." She said nothing. "I'm not asking for anything from you," he said. "I'm not asking you to accept the apology or tell me it's fine. It isn't fine." He said that last part like he'd arrived at it recently, and the arriving had cost something. 23 people are dead, and part of that is my decision. Part of it is the people who killed them, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. Came out anyway. He looked at her. Something flickered in his expression. Not quite surprise, but a recalibration. "Yes," he said. "That's also true." She looked at the motor pool through the window behind him. Vehicles moving in slow patterns. A corporal directing traffic with sharp arm signals. "Sir," she said. "Why did you call me in?" He let a breath out through his nose. "Because there's a conversation happening above my level about what happens to you next. And I've been asked to provide a character assessment. I wanted you to know that." "What did you tell them?" "The truth." He paused. "I told them that your analytical instinct was correct, that your intelligence work was sound, and that the decisions you made on the morning in question were extreme, unsanctioned, and probably saved a significant number of lives." He met her eyes steadily. "I told them that the military has a complicated relationship with people like you. People like me," she said. "People who are right at the wrong time in the wrong way." He said it without apology, just fact. The institution doesn't love that. It doesn't know what to do with it. She thought about Amir saying that depends on what you do next. What are they considering? She said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could tell he was deciding how much of this was appropriate to share, and had already decided, or he wouldn't have called her in. He was just taking a breath before he crossed whatever line he'd drawn. There's a program, he said. Special operations support. The sniper school at Kessler has been expanding its intake to include candidates from non-infantry MOS backgrounds under a pilot program for the last 18 months. High analytical aptitude combined with demonstrated marksmanship. He paused. The program coordinator contacted this command 2 days ago. Cheats. The room went quiet. Not silent. The base made its sounds, the motor pool, the distant thrum of machinery, but the room itself went quiet. They want to put me in sniper school, she said. They want to evaluate whether you're appropriate for the program. That's different. Is it? He almost smiled. Not quite. The letter of reprimand stays in your file. That doesn't change. The program takes candidates with complicated records. It's one of the reasons the pilot was designed the way it was. What matters to them is the skill set and the aptitude. She thought about Montana. Her father's voice telling her to feel the wind before she made the adjustment, not after. She thought about 1,100 meters and a crosswind she'd been gauging since she climbed the tower. She thought about Brooks saying some people have capacity before they have credentials. And if I say no, she said, then you stay in SIGINT and we figure out what your career looks like from here. He said it evenly. That's also a legitimate path. You're good at what you do. The hearing record makes that very clear. But the letter in your file will follow you through every promotion board for the rest of your career, he said. And some of those boards will know the context and weigh it accordingly. Others will see a reprimand and stop reading. She breathed in slowly. When do they need an answer? End of the week. She nodded once. Didn't say anything. He looked at her for a moment, then looked away. Dismissed, Sergeant. She turned to go. Bennett. She stopped. The tower, he said. The widow's post. You made 11 shots in 41 minutes from a condemned structure on a slope you'd never ranged in conditions you'd never trained for. A pause. She didn't turn around. I want you to understand that I know what that means, technically, in terms of what it requires. She waited. I should have read your assessment, he said. She walked out. She gave Amir her answer on Friday. He processed the paperwork with minimal ceremony, tapping his pen twice at the top of the form and twice when he capped it, and told her that reporting instructions would come through within 2 weeks. She thanked him. He said it was his job. She said she knew, but still. The 2 weeks felt both very long and like they'd happened to someone else. On the last night before her transfer, Brooks found her in the DFAC at a corner table with a tray she'd mostly eaten and a cup of coffee she was working through slowly. He came in, got food, and walked over without asking if she minded, which she found she didn't. He sat down. They ate in silence for a while, which was the kind of silence she'd come to associate with people who'd been in the same bad place at different ends of it. I heard Kessler, he said. Word travels. Fort Iron Ridge is a small base. He drank his coffee. You nervous? She thought about it honestly. Yes. Good. He set the cup down. Nervous means you know what it's worth. Is that something someone told you? Probably. I've been told a lot of things. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her in the direct way he'd had since the interrogation room. Can I tell you something you didn't ask for? Seems like you're going to. He almost smiled. The school's going to be harder than the tower. Not technically. Technically, you might be fine. But the tower was alone. You made every decision by yourself, on your own timeline, with no one watching and no one to be wrong in front of. He paused. Kessler's not like that. She looked at her coffee. I know, she said. I don't think you do yet. He said it without meanness. That's not an insult, it's just... The hardest part isn't the shooting. It's learning to trust someone else's call when yours is different. Learning to be part of a two-person system when you've spent 3 years being right by yourself in a signals bay at 4 a.m. He picked up his tray. That's the part that washes people out, not the distance. She looked at him. How many people wash out? 60% in the first month. Standard qualification candidates. He stood up. You're not a standard qualification candidate, which cuts both ways. He took his tray to the return station and came back by her table on the way out, and he stopped for just a moment. "Sergeant?" "Sir." "For what it's worth," he said, "from where I was sitting in that valley, I'll take the two-person team version of you over the solo version of most people I've worked with." He looked at her once more with the flat, steady eyes of a man who didn't say things he didn't mean. "Don't wash out." He walked out of the DFAC. She sat with her coffee until it was cold, thinking about that. Kessler Range Installation was in the high desert, 9 hours by vehicle from Fort Iron Ridge, and it looked the way all training installations looked: functional, relentless, stripped of everything that didn't serve a purpose. The bus that brought her and 11 other candidates in from the main gate deposited them in front of a building that had no designation visible from the outside and a door that required a key card she didn't have yet. A staff sergeant named Kowalski was waiting for them. Kowalski was a medium-sized man who managed to communicate an absolute absence of patience through posture alone, without doing anything specific with his face. He looked them over the way a mechanic looks at a used vehicle. Assessment without sentiment. "Welcome to the Kessler Special Qualification Pilot Program," he said. "You've been selected from different MOS backgrounds based on aptitude assessment and demonstrated performance data. That means none of you are here the normal way. That also means the normal assumptions don't apply." He paused. "I've run this intake 3 times. Statistically, 4 of you will be here in month 2, if I'm being generous." Someone near the back of the group shifted their weight. Kowalski's eyes went there briefly and came back. "You will be assessed on 3 things: technical marksmanship, tactical integration, and judgment under pressure. The first one you can practice. The second one you learn or you don't. The third one—" He stopped. "Let the silence do work. The third one you either have or you've been fooling yourself about having it." He looked at his clipboard. "Bennett." "Sergeant." He looked up from the clipboard, looked at her. The look lasted about 2 seconds longer than his look at anyone else, which meant he'd read her file and was doing something with it. "You'll bunk in Building C. First qualification shoot is 0600 tomorrow. Don't be late." He looked back at the group. "The rest of you follow Specialist Reyes." She picked up her bag. Kowalski said without looking up from the clipboard, "Bennett." She stopped. "The Widow's Post shots," he said. "I've seen the reconstruction, the angles, the conditions, the wind data from that morning." She waited. 11 shots, he said. "Which ones did you miss?" The question dropped into the air between them like a stone into still water. She felt the other candidates near her go still, the ones who hadn't moved yet, who were still in earshot. She felt their attention without looking at them. She could have answered in several ways. She could have said, "I didn't miss," which would have been the kind of thing someone says when they want to sound certain. She could have said, "I don't know," which would have been partially true. She hadn't been able to do a full assessment after the fact. She said, "2 of them I can't confirm. The third vehicle on the eastern ridgeline and one of the early shots on the western position. The gun stopped firing after those shots, but I don't know if I stopped it or they moved." Kowalski looked at her for a moment. "That's the right answer," he said. He went back to his clipboard. She picked up her bag and walked toward Building C, and the desert air was dry and hot and thin in a way that was already telling her things about how ballistics would behave here compared to the mountains. And she filed that away automatically because that was what she did. Behind her, she heard Kowalski begin calling the next name. The first week was attrition by design, not cruelty for its own sake. Nora had been around the military long enough to distinguish between the two, but a systematic application of pressure across every axis simultaneously, designed to find the places where people broke. Sleep deprivation combined with technical precision requirements, physical exhaustion layered under cognitive tasks, and the shooting itself. Not just distance, but position, angle, time constraint, wind variation. The requirement to communicate every element of the shot process to a partner who was also tired and also under pressure, and whose judgment you had to trust in the moment even when your instinct said something different. That last part was the part Brooks had warned her about, and he'd been right that she hadn't entirely understood it yet. Her partner was a sergeant first class named Marcus Webb. Infantry background, 2 combat deployments, exactly the kind of candidate the program was built for in its traditional sense. He was taller than her by 8 inches, and had a stillness about him that she'd initially misread as indifference and later understood as economy. He didn't move or speak when he didn't have a reason to, which made the times he did move or speak carry more information. Their first session together was a ranging exercise, 12 targets at variable distances. No time limit, communication required at each engagement. Webb set up on the rifle. Nora settled into the spotter role. She put her eye to the spotting scope and started reading the conditions. Wind flag at 200 meters showing 4 miles an hour left to right. Denser air at this elevation than she was used to. A slight thermal shimmer off the berm that would affect anything past 800 meters. Winds left to right, she said. 4 miles. Adjust 0.5 right at 500. Full right at 8. Webb made the adjustment without comment. She called the first target. He fired. The impact was 3 inches high. Adjust down, she said. I had it down 2 clicks already. I know. It's the thermal. Go 4. A pause. In that pause, she could feel him deciding something. Not whether she was right, he'd have to shoot to find out, but whether he was going to defer to her read or hold his own. He adjusted 4 clicks down. The next shot was center mass. He didn't say anything, neither did she. They moved to the next target. By the 6th target, they'd found something that wasn't quite a rhythm, but was close to it. The specific functional synchrony of 2 people whose methods don't naturally match, but who've started to identify where the gaps are and fill them without announcing it. She called conditions, and he translated them into adjustments with a speed that told her he was good. Genuinely good. Not program good, but the kind that had been developed over a lot of time, under conditions she could only partially imagine. At the 10th target, she misread the wind shift. She knew it the moment she said it. Left, 2 miles. Felt the flag pull slightly before she'd finished speaking and understood she'd been a half-beat slow. Webb fired. The round went left. He looked at her through the spotting scope without lifting his head. Wind shifted, she said. Yeah. My call was late. Yeah. She looked at the flag. It had settled back. 2 right now. Give it 2 right. He made the adjustment. Fired. Center. They finished the exercise and Kowalski reviewed the log without expression. 10 confirmed hits, 1 miss, 1 called wind error. He wrote something on his clipboard and told them to clean their equipment and be at the classroom in 20 minutes. As they were breaking down the position, Webb said without looking at her, "You caught it." "I was late on it." "You caught it. Some people don't catch it at all." She finished clearing the rifle. "You shoot a lot of solo?" "All of it. Before here." He glanced at her. "You?" "All of it." He made a sound, not quite a laugh. "How's that working for you?" "I'm here," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." They walked to the classroom without talking, and she thought about Brooks in the DFAC saying it's learning to trust someone else's call when yours is different, and she thought Webb was probably thinking about the same kind of thing from the other direction. The 3rd week brought the first real fracture. Not in the shooting, in the room. There were 7 candidates left by then. 4 had washed out in the first 10 days. 2 voluntary withdrawals, 1 injury, 1 performance dismissal that had happened so quietly Nora hadn't known until the bunk was empty. The 7 remaining existed in the specific economy of a closed environment under sustained pressure. Everyone knew everyone's patterns. Everyone knew where the edges were. And everyone was managing the sustained performance of appearing more certain than they felt. A candidate named Sergeant First Class Daly was the problem. Daly was infantry, 12 years in, and carried himself with the weight of that in a way that he might not have been entirely aware of. He was technically proficient, probably the second best pure shooter in the remaining group after a quiet warrant officer named Chen, but he had a habit in the classroom sessions of framing his questions in ways that weren't quite questions. "I want to make sure I understand the wind correction protocol," he said in the 3rd week's evening classroom session, looking at the board rather than at Kowalski. "Because the standard I was trained on uses a different baseline calculation than what Bennett's been calling in the field sessions." Kowalski looked at him. "Your question, Sergeant? Is the protocol she's using the one we're being evaluated on?" The room shifted. 7 people in a close space and 6 of them suddenly very interested in their notebooks. Kowalski said, "Sergeant Bennett, walk him through your wind calculation." She looked at Daly for a moment. He wasn't looking at her. "Range estimation first," she said. "Laser confirm where available. Mil dot backup. Wind read from the nearest flag, then the mid-range indicator. Then anything the terrain gives you: thermals, vegetation, dust. Integrate those into a weighted read based on the dominant layer for the target range. Call the adjustment and hold the call unless you see hard evidence of a shift. She paused. The standard protocol uses a linear interpolation. I use a weighted one because in variable terrain, the dominant layer matters more than the average. She kept her voice even. It's not the standard. It's what I've found to be more accurate in high variability conditions. Daly wrote something in his notebook. And when you're wrong, the room was very still. I call the error incorrect, she said. Same as anyone. The 10th target in the first field session, he said, still not looking at her. Wind call was late. Webb, 2 seats away, looked up from his notebook. Yes, she said. It was. 1 miss in that session. Yes. Kowalski. Daly finally looked at the instructor. I want to understand what the standard for acceptable error is, because it seems like there might be different standards being applied in this room. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't emptiness, but accumulation. Sergeant Daly, he said, what was your miscount in the first field session? A beat. 1. What was the error? Elevation adjustment, thermal variance at 1 miss, Kowalski said. Same as Sergeant Bennett. Different cause, same count. He looked around the room slowly. This is not a competition. If you are treating it as a competition, you have already made a fundamental error about what this program is training you for. He set his chalk down. The target is not the other candidates in this room. The target is a threat situation where 2 people have to function as a single unit under conditions that will try to make that impossible. If you are more focused on the performance of the person next to you than on your own capacity to integrate with them. He stopped. Then you will not be here in week 4. He picked up his chalk. Correction protocol. Standard and variant. Let's go through both. Nora wrote in her notebook without looking at Daly. She could feel his awareness of her in the way you feel weather. Not dramatic, just present. A pressure in the room that wasn't going away. After the session, she was walking back toward Building C when Webb fell into step beside her. That's not done, he said. I know. Daly's good enough that Kowalski won't cut him on performance. I know. So that becomes a you problem, not a him problem. She walked. The desert was dark except for the installation lights, and the sky above them was the kind of clear that only exists at altitude with no light pollution, the stars very sharp and very far away. What would you do? She said. He thought about it for a moment. Outperform him so consistently that the comparison becomes uncomfortable for him to make. He glanced at her. But I'm not the one he's measuring himself against. Why is he measuring himself against me? Webb was quiet for a few steps. Because you came in with a story, he said. The file, the hearing, the tower. Everyone in that room read it before they met you. Some people look at that and feel respect. Some people look at it and feel... He paused. Something else. She thought about that. Some people look at someone who did something extraordinary under no authority and no training, Webb said, and they feel the distance between that and their own considerable competence, and it does something to them that they don't handle cleanly. That's his problem, she said. Yes, Webb said, and those become yours anyway. She didn't have an answer for that. They reached Building C and he peeled off toward his own bunk, and she went inside and lay down on her cot in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about Daly's voice saying, when you're wrong, the specific weight he'd put on that when. And she thought about 11 shots at the widow's post and the 2 she couldn't confirm, and she thought that the question Kowalski had asked her on the first day was the most important test she'd been given, and she hadn't known it at the time. Which ones did you miss? The right answer wasn't the number. The right answer was that she knew which ones she wasn't sure about. She closed her eyes. The desert made no sound. At this altitude, this time of night, there was just the absence of wind and the distant hum of the installation generator, steady and low. And she lay inside that sound and let herself be tired in the way she hadn't fully let herself be tired since the tower. She had been right once in a way that mattered enormously. She was somewhere now where right had to become consistent instead of singular. She knew the difference. She just didn't know yet if she could cross it. The generator hum was still there when she woke at 0430. Same frequency, same rhythm, like the installation breathed at a fixed rate regardless of what happened inside it. She lay still for a moment in the dark and ran through the wind correction protocol in her head. Not the standard, not her variant, both of them, side by side, the places they diverged and why, until she could feel the logic of each one as a physical thing rather than a memorized sequence. Then she got up, dressed in the dark without waking the one other woman in the bunk room, a warrant officer named Tron who slept like she'd been switched off, and went outside into the desert cold to think. The sky was still black at the edges. She could see the rifle range in the middle distance, the target berms dark shapes against darker ground. She stood with her hands in her jacket pockets and breathed the thin air, and thought about what Webb had said. Because you came in with a story. She'd been trying not to think about that. Not the story itself, but the way it preceded her. The file, the hearing record, the reconstruction of the widow's post shots that Kowalski had mentioned on day one. She'd understood abstractly that people would have read it before she arrived. She hadn't fully accounted for what that meant in the actual room. The problem with the story was that it set a shape, and then everything you did afterward either confirmed it or didn't, and neither of those was neutral. Confirm it, and people decided you were performing. Fail to confirm it, and people decided you'd been lucky. There was no version of entering a room with that file where the room looked at you plainly. She'd been looked at plainly exactly once since the Carvin Pass, and that was by Kowalski on the first day with the question about the missed shots. Which ones did you miss? She thought about that question the whole walk back to the building. Week 4 opened with a change in the program structure that Kowalski announced in the 0600 brief with the same absence of ceremony he brought to everything. Pairs are being shuffled, he said, starting today. You'll rotate partners through the remaining assessment period. Reason: a two-person team that only works with one partner isn't a functional skill set, it's a relationship. We're not training relationships. He read the new pairings from his clipboard. Webb was moved to Chen. Nora was moved to Daly. She kept her face still. Beside her, she felt Daly do the same. Kowalski looked up from the clipboard. He might have let his gaze rest on the two of them for a fraction of a second longer than anyone else. She couldn't be sure. First rotation field session is at 0800, he said. Dismissed. She didn't look at Daly as they filed out. She didn't avoid looking at him either. She went to the equipment room, drew her assigned rifle, and began function checking it with the specific focused attention that she used when she needed her hands to have something to do. He came in 2 minutes later. She heard him cross to his locker, heard the sounds of his equipment check, methodical, unhurried. Neither of them spoke. It lasted about 4 minutes. I'm going to say something, Daly said. She kept working. Okay. What I said in the classroom, the way I said it. A pause. That wasn't the right move. She set the rifle down and looked at him. He was looking back at her without the oblique quality from the classroom session. Direct, uncomfortable, someone who'd made themselves do something. I hear you, she said. That's not an apology, he said. I'm not apologizing for the question. The question was legitimate. The framing was... He stopped. The framing was about something else. I know what it was about. He held her gaze. I've been doing this for 12 years. You've been doing it for... I haven't been doing this at all, she said. That's not the same as what happened in that valley. No, he said. It isn't. He picked up his kit. I need to know that when I'm in the spotter position and I call something, you'll take it without making it a negotiation. I need the same thing from you. You'll have it. He said it flatly, not as a gesture, but as a statement of terms. Can you give me the same? She thought about week 2, the 6th target, the wind shift she'd called right. She thought about the 10th target, the half beat she'd been slow on, and the way she'd said my call was late instead of looking for another explanation. Yes, she said. He nodded once. They finished their equipment checks without talking further, and when they walked to the field together, the silence between them was different from what it had been in the classroom. Not hostile, not warm, just functional. The silence of two people who'd said what needed saying and were now focused on the thing that mattered. The 0800 session was long-range variable, 8 targets from 900 to 1300 meters, partner rotation at target 4. Wind was running 12 miles cross with gusts that came in irregular intervals off the ridge to the northwest. The worst kind of condition, because irregular meant you were always half a reed behind. Daly was on the rifle first. Nora set up in the spotter position and began reading. The first two targets were straightforward. She called, he adjusted, both hits. She could feel him processing her calls differently than Webb had. Webb worked with a kind of absorbed fluency, integrating the information fast. Daly held each call for a half-second longer, running it against his own read before acting. She could feel that half-second. It wasn't doubt, exactly. It was the legitimate processing of a man who'd spent 12 years making his own calls and was currently in the process of restructuring that habit in real time. Third target. Gus came in right as she finished the wind call. "Hold," she said. He held. The Gus passed. She read the flag return. "Same call. Go." He fired. Hit. At target 4, they switched. She settled behind the rifle and Daly moved to the scope. 950, he said. Target's partially obscured, left edge of the berm. Wind's dropping, I'd say 8 miles now. She breathed, found the target. He was right about the drop. She could see the flag behavior had changed in the last 30 seconds. "Concur," she said. 8 miles. "Adjust point 4 right. Give me a read on your point of aim." She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "Go half a mil higher," he said. "Mirage off the berm is pulling low." She looked again. She hadn't caught the mirage because she'd been reading the flag. He'd caught it from the scope. "Confirmed," she said, and made the adjustment. The shot was clean. She felt something shift in the space between them. Not drama, just the small solid click of two people finding where they fit. They worked through the remaining targets without a miss. Kowalski reviewed the log afterward. He made one notation and asked Daly one question about the 7th target wind read. Daly walked him through it. Kowalski made another notation. He didn't say they'd done well. He didn't say anything beyond the technical review. But when he dismissed them, he looked at Nora for a moment with the same expression he'd had after she'd answered the question about the missed shots. Not approval exactly, but something that registered. She filed it away. The 5th week brought the psychological assessment component, which was delivered not as a formal test, but as a series of scenario exercises that looked like tactical problems until you were deep enough inside them that they'd become something else. The first scenario. A building complex. 2 personnel inside, 1 confirmed threat, 1 unconfirmed. Engagement decision under a 90-second time constraint with incomplete information, partner calling the final authorization. She was on the rifle. Daly was on comms. "Target 1 is confirmed," Daly said through the earpiece. "Target 2. I'm reading a phone. Could be a trigger device, could be civilian." She had the scope on target 2, medium build, standing in a doorway. The phone was in the right hand, raised, the angle wrong for a call. "Body language," she said. "What?" "His body language. Is he watching the approach or watching the phone?" A beat. "Watching the approach," Daly said. "He's spotting. Call it. That's your call, Bennett. I need a..." "You have the comms picture. I have the scope picture. Combined call. He's spotting for target 1. Do you confirm or not?" A longer beat. She could hear him processing. 12 years of operational experience being run against a scenario designed to put the authorization exactly in the place where nobody wanted it. "Confirmed," Daly said. She stayed on target 2 until the scenario clock stopped. Afterward, in the debrief, the program psychologist, a civilian contractor named Dr. Aldous, who had the energy of someone who had seen every way a person could fail under pressure and was neither surprised nor satisfied by any of them, walked them through the scenario structure. "The phone was a prop," Aldous said. "Target 2 was a civilian. In this scenario, both of you have authorized an engagement that would have resulted in a civilian casualty." Nora absorbed that. "The combined call structure you used," Aldous looked at his notes. Sergeant Bennett initiated an integrated assessment request rather than making a unilateral engagement decision. Sergeant Daly provided authorization based on combined intelligence rather than scope picture alone. He paused. "That's the correct protocol. The outcome was still wrong." "Because the information was wrong," Daly said. "Yes. The information was wrong. You processed it correctly and reached the wrong conclusion." Aldous looked at both of them. "Can you tell me why that matters?" Silence. Nora said, "Because correct process and correct outcome aren't the same thing." "And?" She thought about it. And if you only debrief outcomes, you'll change process in response to outcomes instead of in response to process failures, which means you'll keep the wrong process if it gets lucky enough. Aldous made a note. He looked at her with the same flat registering quality as Kowalski, the look of someone adding data to a picture they'd been building for a while. That's the most important thing I'll say this week, he said. You can leave. She walked out into the afternoon heat and stood in it for a moment. Daly came out behind her. Civilian, he said. Yeah, I've made that call for real. He said it quietly. Not in a scenario. She looked at him. I got it right that time, he said. I've spent 5 years since then wondering how I knew. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that. She just stood with him in the heat for a moment and let it be the size it was. The formal assessment came at the end of week 6, and it was not a test in any form Nora had expected. Kowalski told them the night before. A mission profile, real conditions simulation, 12-hour execution window, 2-person teams operating independently in the field with communication blackout after the initial brief. Target acquisition, position establishment, observation and reporting, 1 engagement decision window. All of it evaluated by instructors in the field who they would not see and could not communicate with. This is not the graduation exercise, Kowalski said. This is the assessment that determines whether there is a graduation exercise. If a team fails to complete the profile, for any reason, equipment, judgment, communication, engagement decision, that team does not proceed. He looked at the remaining candidates. 5 of them. Webb and Chen, Nora and Daly, and the quiet warrant officer, Tron, who had been paired with no one for 2 days following her previous partner's withdrawal, and who had spent those 2 days working alone on the range with a consistency that Nora found quietly formidable. Questions? Kowalski said. Nothing. 0400 brief. Get some sleep. She didn't sleep well. She lay in the dark and ran the mission parameters in her head. The terrain map they'd been given, the approach route options, the elevation data, the window for the engagement decision, and somewhere around 0200 she stopped running parameters and just lay there with the ceiling. She thought about the Article 32 hearing, about Dorn's notepad and Hale's face, and Amir's pen tapping twice. She thought about Walsh saying noted, Sergeant, and the 2-word email sitting in the system with a timestamp that proved the assessment had arrived and been received and set aside. She thought about Jimenez asleep in his chair with the headset around his neck, and how she'd always let that go because he was 20 and new and it was 4 in the morning. She thought about her father's voice. Feel the wind before you make the adjustment, not after. He'd meant that literally when he said it. She'd been 12, in a field in Montana, and the shot had gone wide and he'd said it in the patient, unhurried way he said most things. She'd understood later that he meant it as something larger, not just ballistics. The whole architecture of a decision, building the read before the moment of commitment, not reacting to what had already happened. She'd done that at the Carvon Pass. She'd built the read over 4 days, and the read had been right, and nobody had wanted it until it was too late to want anything else. She was here now to learn to do it with someone beside her. She thought she might be getting there. The 0400 brief was 14 minutes long. Kowalski gave them the target package, the communication protocol, and the engagement authorization criteria in the flat, complete way he gave everything. No context, no encouragement, no suggestion of what a good outcome looked like. Just the parameters. She and Daly studied the terrain map for 20 minutes after the brief, talking through approach options in the low voices of people who'd gotten past the need to perform competence at each other. The eastern approach gives us better elevation at the cost of exposure on the final 400 meters, Daly said. Western gives us covered approach, but the angle on the target window is 15 degrees off optimal. What's your read on the eastern exposure? She looked at the map. The 400 meters of open ground were the problem. A trained observer in the target area would have a clear sight line for much of it, but the approach window was pre-dawn, which changed the math. Low light, we're moving slow. Terrain's broken enough that we can use the rock formations for intervals, she said. If we stage at the last cover point and wait for the thermal shift, she traced the contour lines. Around 0610, the air movement in this valley runs east to west, dust and haze off the floor. We'd have maybe 20 minutes of natural visual degradation. Daly looked at the map for a moment. That's a tight window. It's enough. He thought about it. She watched him think about it. The real thinking, not the half-second processing she'd felt in the early field sessions, but longer. The kind of consideration that meant he was actually weighing it against his own read and not just running it against his default. "Okay," he said. "Eastern approach. We stage at the last rock formation and move on the thermal." They were in position by 0558. The terrain was rougher than the map suggested in the final approach. It usually was, and they'd had to adjust their route twice to maintain the cover intervals, which cost them time they hadn't entirely budgeted for. She'd felt the time pressure as a physical thing in her chest and had deliberately not let it affect her movement rate, because a rushed approach on open ground was worse than a late approach on covered ground, and she'd had to tell herself that twice. They were prone behind the rock formation at 0558, with 12 minutes until the thermal window. "Spotter or rifle?" Daly said, very quietly. "Your call," she said. A pause. She felt him register that she'd given it to him. "I'll spot," he said. "You shoot." She settled the rifle into her shoulder and started her pre-shot routine. Breathing, position, natural point of aim, range to target confirmed at 940. Wind reading from the vegetation in the draw below. Negligible, maybe 2 miles, consistent. At 0610 the air moved. She could feel it before she saw it, the slight shift in temperature, the haze beginning to lift off the valley floor and drift east. "Windows open," Daly said. "Confirmed. Target is in the acquisition zone, stationary, no secondary personnel visible." "Concur. Single target." "Wind?" 2 miles, right to left, inconsistent. I'd call it 1.5 effective." "Concur." A beat. "Authorization window is open. Your call." She looked through the scope at the target zone, the engagement simulator, a metal plate with a heat signature element that the program used for live assessment scenarios. The plate was there. The conditions were what they were. She breathed out halfway and held it, and then Daly said very quietly, "Bennett, I'm on it. I know. There's a secondary element. Left of the target. Just entered the zone." She shifted the scope. There was movement. A figure barely visible through the haze, crossing behind the target. "Civilian?" she said. "Unknown. They're not stopping. Moving through." She tracked the movement. The figure's pace, direction, posture. Not tactical movement. Not the body language of someone operating with intent. Just someone crossing the space. "Civilian?" she said. "I concur. Hold." "Hold." They waited. The figure crossed the zone and moved out of it. The haze was beginning to settle back. They had maybe 6 minutes of window left. "Zone is clear," Daly said. "Confirmed. I'm on target." "Your call." She fired. The simulator plate registered a hit. She knew it from the way the heat element pulsed, a visual she'd been briefed to look for. Center of the engagement zone. Daly said nothing for a moment. "Clean," he said. She breathed out the rest of the held breath and kept her position while Daly continued the observation protocol, reporting the post-engagement status through the single authorized communication channel at the 12-minute mark. She listened to him do it, the clipped, precise language of someone who'd done this for real and carried that with him into the simulation. And she thought that 12 years of the right kind of experience was not nothing, and that she'd been right not to think of him as an obstacle. He was just a person, complicated in the ways people were complicated. Same as her. The debrief was at 1600. All 5 remaining candidates, Kowalski, 2 program evaluators whose names she hadn't been given, and Dr. Aldous in the back corner with his notepad. Kowalski read through the assessment logs in order. Webb and Chen, clean execution, 1 judgment hold that the evaluators confirmed was correct. Tran, solo adapted protocol. There'd been an equipment failure in her team's communication system, and she'd executed the profile on the modified single-operator protocol, which was not the scenario they'd been given, but which she'd managed with the kind of flat efficiency that Nora suspected was just how Tran moved through the world. Then Kowalski reached her and Daly's log. "Eastern approach," he said. "Adjusted route twice. Staged on time. Thermal window confirmed." He paused. "Engagement hold at 0614 for a secondary element in the zone. Hold duration. 3 minutes? 20 seconds. Element cleared. Engagement executed. Hit confirmed." He set the log down. "The secondary element. Walk me through the call. Daly spoke first. I identified the movement and called a hold. Bennett was on the rifle. Bennett. I agreed with the hold, she said. The element's movement pattern and posture weren't consistent with a threat. Civilian assessment, concurred by both of us. The secondary element was a civilian, Kowalski said. Correct call. She nodded. The hold cost you 4 minutes of your window. You had 6 minutes remaining when you engaged. If the civilian element had been 2 minutes slower, you'd have been outside the window. Yes, she said. Was that a factor in your hold decision? She thought about it honestly. I was aware of it. It didn't change the call. Why not? Because a wrong engagement decision doesn't become right because the window was closing. Kowalski looked at her for a long moment. One of the evaluators wrote something. Aldous made a note in the back. Correct, Kowalski said. He closed the log. He looked at the group. All 5 teams proceed to the final qualification exercise. Scheduling and parameters will be provided at 0600 tomorrow. He picked up his clipboard and left without any further comment, because that was how Kowalski did things, and she'd learned that the absence of additional comment from him was itself a kind of language. She sat with that for a moment. Then Daly, beside her, said very quietly, 4 minutes to spare. 3 minutes 20, she said. Yeah. A pause. Tight. Yeah. She looked at the front of the room where Kowalski had been standing. Outside through the window, the desert was beginning its late afternoon color change, the light going amber and low, the shadows stretching long across the range. 3 minutes and 20 seconds. She thought about the convoy at kilometer 7, about 0503 hours, and a confirmation burst on the eastern frequency, and the 47 minutes between that and departure that nobody had used. Time was always the variable that didn't cooperate. She'd learned that at 27 in a signals bay, and she was learning it again here, in a different context with different stakes, and she suspected she would keep learning it in some form for a long time. Daly stood up. She stood up. They walked out of the debrief room into the amber afternoon, and neither of them spoke, and the silence was the kind that doesn't need filling. The 0600 brief the next morning lasted 9 minutes. Kowalski stood in front of the group with his clipboard and his coffee and told them the final qualification exercise would run over 2 days in the northern sector of the installation, terrain they hadn't trained on, conditions they couldn't fully predict. Each team would be given a mission package at the insertion point. No pre-briefing beyond that. Communication protocol was the same as the assessment. Evaluators would be in the field. This is not a test of what you've learned, he said. It's a test of what you are when what you've learned runs out. He looked at his clipboard. Webb and Chen, Sector 7, Tran, Sector 9, Bennett and Daly, Sector 12. He drank his coffee. Questions? Nothing. Vehicles depart at 0730. Eat something. She ate something. She didn't taste it. Across the table, Daly was reading the terrain description card they'd been given. 1 page, topographical overview, no target data, with the focused stillness she'd come to recognize as his version of preparation. He wasn't anxious. She'd stopped reading him as closed off. What she'd initially taken for distance was just the way he got quiet when it mattered. Webb came by on his way out and knocked twice on the table near her tray. Not words, just acknowledgement. She nodded back. At 0725, she shouldered her kit and walked to the vehicle line. Sector 12 was a high-elevation valley system, narrow, with variable ridge terrain on both sides and a creek bed running through the center that was dry this time of year and left white-gray rock exposed in twisting lines like old scar tissue. The vehicle dropped them at the insertion point, a flat rock shelf about 200 meters above the valley floor, and drove away. And the silence that followed was the particular silence of a high place with no wind, not peaceful, just empty. The mission package was a waterproof envelope attached to a metal stake at the coordinates they'd been given. Daly pulled it, opened it, read it, handed it to her without comment. 2 targets. Stationary positions at undisclosed locations within a 3-kilometer operational box. 48-hour window. Engagement authorized on positive identification only. Rules of engagement attached. 2 pages, specific, unambiguous about what positive ID required. And 1 additional line at the bottom of the package, which she read twice. Secondary mission. In the event of a compromise scenario, partner extraction is a primary objective. Mission abort criteria are defined by team judgment only. She handed it back. Partner extraction, Daly said. Yeah. That's new. Yeah. He folded the package and put it in his chest pocket. She looked at the valley below them and the ridgelines on either side and started reading the terrain the way she read frequency traffic, not looking for what was there but for what should be there and wasn't. I want to go northeast, she said. The western ridge is obvious, but it gives us a single firing lane. Northeast, we get 2 angles on the operational box. Daly looked at the terrain. Northeast approach is exposed on the lower traverse. We move it at last light. He thought about it. That works. He adjusted his kit. You lead, I'll read behind you. They moved. The first night was cold in the way high desert gets cold. Not gradually, but suddenly. The temperature dropping 40 degrees in 90 minutes after sundown, the stars coming out hard and bright overhead. They'd established a hide position in the northeastern ridgeline by 1900, a natural rock formation that gave them a covered approach from behind and sightlines into roughly 60% of the operational box. She was on the scope. Daly was managing the observation log and the communication window. At 2140, she found the first target. It was a heat signature from the thermal scope, a person-sized element in a fixed position near the southern edge of the box, partially obscured by scrub vegetation. She tracked it for 11 minutes before calling it. Target 1, she said. South sector. Bearing 175, range 820, stationary, consistent with established position. Daly logged it. Positive ID criteria? Not yet. Need activity confirmation. She watched. The figure moved at 2154. A specific movement, deliberate, the kind that matched the behavioral indicators in the rules of engagement. She noted it, continued watching. Activity confirmed at 2154, she said. Target 1 meets positive ID criteria. Logged. Engagement window? Not yet. We need target 2. Daly was quiet for a moment. Window's 22 hours. I know. Just noting it. I know, she said again, and this time he heard what was in it and didn't push. She kept watching. Target 2 appeared at 0330 in the northeastern quadrant of the box, and it took her longer to confirm because the position was better. Whoever had designed this exercise had given the second target better cover than the first, and the activity indicators were subtler, which meant she had to watch longer before she had what the rules of engagement required. She had it by 0412. Target 2 confirmed, she said. Northeast quadrant, bearing 040, range 1110. Positive ID criteria met at 0412. Daly logged it, without comment, then said, Engagement sequence? Target 1 first, closer range, higher confidence on the position, then immediate reposition. The second shot will give our position. Reposition to where? She'd been thinking about that since 0200. The rock shelf at bearing 260 from current position. 40 meters. It's a worse angle on target 2, but we'll have the ridge behind us and I can work with 1100 from there. That's a hard 40 meters in the dark. I know the route. I've been looking at it for 6 hours. He thought about it. Okay, I'll manage extraction cover during the reposition. You move first on my call. She looked at him in the dark. She could see the outline of him, no more than that. You're sure? You're faster than me on uneven ground, he said. It was a factual statement, not a concession. She'd learned to hear the difference. Okay, she said. They waited for the communication window at 0430, reported target confirmation, received acknowledgement. Then they settled back into the particular patience of people who understood that the next hours were about not moving, not making noise, not making decisions until the conditions were right, which was the hardest kind of discipline there was. At 0610, the light was what she needed. Ready? She said. Ready, Daly said. She engaged target 1. The shot was clean. She knew it before the data came back. The feel of the trigger break, the read on the conditions, the way everything in her body had been still for the half second that mattered. The simulator element registered. She was already moving. Daly's hand was on her shoulder immediately, guiding her through the dark over ground she'd memorized 6 hours ago, and was now executing at the speed that memory and muscle and the specific urgency of having just announced their position could manage. She hit the rock shelf in 38 seconds, and was down before he arrived 3 seconds behind her. "Position set," he said, barely a whisper. "Set." She found the new angle. Target 2 was still there. The second simulator element hadn't moved. 1,110 meters slightly uphill, dawn light coming from the east and helping her. She read the new wind, different from the hide position, funneling through the valley differently. "Wind's changed," she said. "What do you have?" 4 miles right to left, but it's inconsistent. The valley's channeling it. Could spike. Call it. She watched the vegetation in the draw below target 2's position. 2 seconds. 3. 4 consistent, she said. "I'm taking it." She fired. The simulator element registered. Daly exhaled slowly beside her. She lay still on the rock shelf and watched the eastern light continue its slow arrival over the ridgeline and felt the thing she always felt after a shot. Not satisfaction, not relief, just the neutral return of the world to its normal pace after the suspension of the moment itself. 38 seconds on the reposition, Daly said after a moment. "Was that okay? I had you at 45 in the plan. The ground was better than I thought in the middle section." "Yeah." A pause. "Good." They held the position for the required observation period, logged the engagement confirmation, then began the methodical process of clearing their hide and preparing for extraction. No conversation, just the familiar language of two people who'd spent enough time in close quarters under pressure that the division of tasks happened without negotiation. The extraction vehicle found them at 11:40. The graduation assessment debrief was held at 1400, all 5 remaining candidates, all evaluators. Kowalski standing at the front of the room with his clipboard, which she'd come to understand was less an organizational tool than a physical habit, something to hold while he thought. He went through each team's execution log with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. No performance, no commentary beyond the technical. Webb and Chen had completed their mission with one deviation from the planned approach that the evaluators had flagged and then cleared as a legitimate adaptation to changed conditions. Tran had executed a solo mission package after a comms failure and had done so with a precision that Kowalski noted in his way by reading her log slightly more slowly than the others. He reached Bennett and Daly. He read the log. The target confirmations, the engagement sequence, the reposition timing, the second engagement. "Reposition executed in 38 seconds, he said. "Plan allowed 45. He looked up. "Whose ground read?" he said. "Mine," Nora said. "I had 6 hours on the route." He made a note. "Second engagement, 1110 meters, wind call under inconsistent valley conditions. Walk me through the decision." She walked him through it. The vegetation read. The 2 seconds of observation, the judgment call on consistency. "You called it consistent," Kowalski said. "It could have spiked." "Yes." "Why didn't you wait for more data?" "Because waiting was also a decision," she said. The inconsistency was irregular but low amplitude. A spike in that valley system would have been visible in the vegetation before it reached the target range. I had enough time to see it if it came. It didn't. Kowalski looked at her for a moment. "Correct analysis," he said. He closed the log. He looked at the group. All 5 candidates have successfully completed the final qualification exercise. Nothing dramatic happened. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of room. Webb nodded once. Tran's expression didn't change, but something in her posture did, very slightly. Daly looked at his hands for a moment and then looked up. "Graduation is in 3 days, Kowalski said. "Family and unit representatives may attend. Details will be provided." He picked up his clipboard. "Dismissed." He walked toward the door, then stopped with his back to them. "Bennett," he said. "Sergeant?" He turned. 1110 meters, valley wind, dawn light. He looked at her steadily. "That's a hard shot." "Yes," she said. "You didn't rush it." "No." He nodded once, like something had been confirmed. Then he walked out. She called her mother that evening from the phone bank in the common building. Her mother picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been near the phone, which meant she'd been waiting. "Nora." "Hi, Mom." A pause. Her mother had learned, over years of these calls, to listen to the quality of the pause before she asked anything. "You're okay," her mother said. Not a question, an assessment. "Yeah. You sound different." She thought about that. I'm tired. Different tired or regular tired? Different. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Good different or bad different? She looked at the wall of the phone bank, at the scratches and old adhesive marks where someone had taped something up years ago and it had been removed. Small evidence of people who'd stood here before her, also calling someone, also trying to find the right words for something that didn't fit neatly into a phone call. I think good, she said. I'm not completely sure yet. Her mother said, okay. Just that. It was one of the things about her mother that she'd never found anywhere else. The ability to receive an incomplete answer as a complete one, to hold space for the things that hadn't resolved yet. I graduate in 3 days, Nora said. Her mother was quiet for a beat. Graduate from what? The program I've been in. She paused. It's a sniper qualification, Mom. Another beat, longer. Okay, her mother said again. Different weight this time. Do you want me there? She hadn't expected the question, and the unexpectedness of it pressed against something she hadn't known was close to the surface. You don't have to come, she said. It's a long way. Nora, do you want me there? She looked at the wall. Yeah, she said, I do. 3 days later, on a morning that was clear and dry and cold, the way the high desert was cold at 0800, the graduation was held on the main range. It was not elaborate. A formation, a brief ceremony, the presentation of the qualification badge, a small metal device that Kowalski pinned to each candidate's uniform with the same efficient lack of ceremony he brought to everything, and a brief statement from the program coordinator, a major named Voss who ran the pilot program from an administrative office, and who appeared in person on graduation days and visitation days only, and whose brief statement was professional and unmemorable. Her mother stood with the small group of family and observers at the range perimeter. She'd driven 11 hours and arrived the night before, and had been waiting at the visitor center when Nora came to get her, and they'd sat in the fluorescent light of the visitor common room and talked about Montana and the house and the neighbor's dog and everything except what was happening, which was its own kind of conversation. After the badge was pinned, Nora walked to where her mother was standing. Her mother looked at her, at the badge, back at her face. You're not going to tell me it was easy, her mother said. No. Good. She reached out and straightened the collar of Nora's uniform, which didn't need straightening. An old habit. Your father would have had something specific to say about this. Something about wind, probably. Her mother's expression did something complicated. Probably, she said. They stood together for a moment in the morning light, watching the other candidates talk to their families. Webb and a woman Nora took to be his wife. The interaction between them quiet and practiced. Tran alone, by her own choice, looking at the range with the focused calm that seemed to be her default state. Daily with 2 other people, a sister, maybe, and an older man who had the bearing of someone who'd been in uniform for a long time and carried it still even in civilian clothes. Daly caught her eye across the distance. He tilted his chin slightly. She did the same. That was all. The official investigation findings came through 2 weeks later, delivered to her in a document that Amir emailed her with a brief note. Read pages 4 to 7, then read page 12. Call me if you want to talk. She read it in the administrative office at Kessler on a Tuesday afternoon. Pages 4 through 7 detailed the review board's findings on the intelligence handling failure in the lead-up to the Carvon Pass ambush. The language was careful and institutional, and buried the weight of it under procedural terminology. But the weight was there. A systemic failure to transmit complete analytical data through the command chain, a command decision made on the basis of incomplete intelligence, and a pattern, this was the word that stood out, a pattern of insufficient review of non-commissioned analytical submissions from the Signals Intelligence Bay at Fort Iron Ridge. The pattern, not an incident, a pattern. She read that section twice. Page 12 was Colonel Hale. He had been recommended for formal review by a military efficiency board. The specific language was that his command judgments in the period preceding the Carvon Pass incident had demonstrated a pattern of insufficient analytical rigor in intelligence review. He was not being forced out. The document was careful about that. But the efficiency board recommendation, in the institutional language she'd learned to translate, meant that his career had reached a terminal point. He would retire. The question was only timing and terms. She sat with that for a while. She thought she would feel something sharper when she read it. Vindication had a sound in her imagination, something clean, something that resolved. What she actually felt was more complicated and less satisfying. A man who'd built 31 years of legitimate service had made one structural mistake, repeated across time, and it had collided with an ambush that killed 23 people, and the investigation had found the place where those things connected. None of that was simple. None of it felt like winning. She thought about him saying, "I don't know when," Dorn asked if he'd have delayed the convoy. The most honest thing anyone had said in that room. She closed the document. Then she opened her email and wrote Amir a short message. "I read it. Thank you for everything." She thought about whether to add anything else and decided she didn't need to. The letter arrived a month after graduation. It came through official channels, which meant it had been processed and cleared and was therefore real in the institutional sense, not preliminary or conditional. Assignment to a special operations support element, attached to a unit she'd been briefed on in general terms, but whose full designation she'd only learn upon reporting. Operational, not training. Real missions, real conditions, real stakes. She read it standing in her bunk room at Kessler, which she had 2 more weeks before vacating. Tran was on the other side of the room, packing her own equipment with the systematic efficiency she brought to everything. She didn't ask what the letter said. She probably knew or had a good guess. "Tran," Nora said. The warrant officer looked up. "Good luck," Nora said. Tran looked at her for a moment with the flat, considering attention that she'd given to everything since day one. "You too, Sergeant." A pause. "Don't let the first one stay with you too long." Nora looked at her. "The first what?" "Whichever one it is for you," Tran said. "The first one that doesn't leave cleanly." She went back to her packing. "They all stay to some degree, but the first one is the one people either manage or they don't." She said it the way someone says a thing they've already worked out for themselves over time. Not advice exactly, more like a coordinate to navigate by. Nora folded the letter and put it in her chest pocket. "How do you manage it?" she said. Tran thought about it. "You decide what you were doing it for," she said, "and you make sure the answer is true. If it's true, you can carry it." She closed her bag. "If it's not, it carries you." She went back to Fort Iron Ridge once more before she reported to her new assignment. She hadn't planned to. There was no administrative reason, no requirement, but she drove the 9 hours anyway on a Thursday, arriving in the late afternoon when the base had the low-traffic quiet of end of week. She didn't go to the command building. She didn't look for Walsh or Jimenez or anyone from the signals bay. She drove to the north perimeter, parked, and walked. The widow's post was visible from the perimeter road. She stood and looked at it for a while. A cracked concrete structure on a ridgeline 2 kilometers out, catching the late sun at an angle that made the damage to the upper section very clear. The deteriorated wall, the gap she'd set up in, the iron stair rail visible against the sky. She thought about 0541 hours on a specific morning. The smell of the rifle, the sound of the valley going wrong below her, the way her hands hadn't shaken until it was over. She thought about what Tran had said. You decide what you were doing it for, and you make sure the answer is true. She knew the answer. She'd known it since 05:03 on the morning of the convoy, when she'd listened to an 11-second confirmation burst on an Eastern frequency and understood what it meant. She'd done what she'd done because 500 people were driving into something she could see, and they couldn't, and the window for using the right channels had closed, and she'd had to choose between the rules and the reason the rules existed. She'd lived with the complexity of that for a long time, probably forever. That was what carrying it felt like. She looked at the tower for another minute, then turned and walked back to her vehicle. The sun was going down over the western ridgeline, painting the mountain road in amber and shadow, and somewhere in the valley below the Carvon Pass lay quiet and ordinary in the evening light, the way places do when the thing that happened in them is over. She drove away without looking back. 2 years later, Nora Bennett stood at the front of a range classroom at Kessler Installation, in front of 11 candidates who'd been selected from different backgrounds, and who were looking at her the way people look at someone they've read about before they met, with the shape of a story already in their heads, waiting to be confirmed or complicated. She'd been assigned as an instructor for the pilot program's 5th intake. Not permanently. Not a career change. 3 months, 2 intakes per year, rotating alongside her operational assignment. Kowalski had told her the program coordinator wanted her specifically, and she'd asked why, and he'd said, "Because you know what the first week feels like from both sides of the table." And she hadn't had a response to that. She stood at the front of the room and looked at 11 people who were tired and uncertain and performing confidence at each other in the specific way of people who'd been selected for something and were not yet sure they deserved it. She set her notes on the table. "My name is Sergeant Bennett," she said. "Before we start, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want an honest answer, not the one that sounds right." She looked at them. "What do you think this program is trying to find out about you?" Silence. Then one of them, young infantry, sat near the back, said, "Whether we can shoot accurately under pressure." "That's part of it," she said. "What else?" Another candidate. "Whether we can work with a partner. Closer." She let that sit. "The program is trying to find out whether you know the difference between what you're good at and what you're right about. Those aren't the same thing. Most people spend their careers treating them like they are." She looked at the room. "The first week is going to be hard. Not because the tasks are hard. Some of them are, but you'll manage the tasks. It's hard because the program is going to put you in positions where your own judgment is the only authority you have, and it's going to ask you to be honest about that judgment, even when honesty is the more expensive answer." The room was quiet. She had their attention in the way you get attention when you've said something true. "One more thing," she said. "When you miss, and you will miss, I need to know which shots you weren't sure about, not just the confirmed misses, the uncertain ones." She looked at the back of the room, at the young infantry candidate. "That's the question that matters most in this program. Not how good you are, how honest you are about the edges of how good you are." She picked up her notes. "Let's start. The abandoned tower at Fort Iron Ridge was eventually demolished 18 months after Nora graduated from Kessler as part of a base infrastructure renewal project. A facilities report noted the structure as beyond remediation and cited safety concerns. No one erected anything in its place. The ridgeline stayed empty. But 412 people were alive who might not have been, scattered across bases and cities and ordinary lives. And most of them didn't think about the Carvon Pass anymore, except sometimes, at odd moments, when the particular quality of light or the sound of a distant engine caught them off guard and brought it back briefly before letting it go. That was its own kind of monument, quieter than concrete, harder to demolish. Nora never called herself a hero. She'd been asked twice, once by a journalist who'd gotten enough of the story through unofficial channels to write something, and once by a candidate in her third intake who'd done enough research to find her name connected to the incident. Both times she'd said the same thing. She'd seen something coming that others hadn't seen yet. She'd said so, through the right channels, and the right channels had failed. So she'd done the only thing left to do, and then she'd lived inside the consequences of it, which was the part nobody mentioned when they said the word hero. The consequences had brought her here, to this classroom, to this range, to 11 people who were about to have the hardest weeks of their careers and who would be, if the program worked the way it was supposed to work, different on the other side of it. Not better, clearer. That was the difference. The hardest truth about courage isn't the moment you act. It's accepting, without excuse, everything that follows.